Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karen Bennett. I'm Associate Curator for Education here at BAMPFA. Am I loud enough or too loud? Good? Okay. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. As we gather here today, we acknowledge that UC Berkeley sits on Huichin territory, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community benefits from the use and occupation of this land. To go beyond words, I wanted to mention the Shumi Land Tax, a program of voluntary annual contributions that supports the work of Sogorea Te Land Trust. We encourage you to learn about their projects if you don't already know, and we have printed out the first page from their very informative website, which we'll make available for you to pick up as you leave. As far as masks, just to say, our masks up here will be off for the purposes of speaking, but we ask everyone to please keep them on while you're amongst each other. And I have some particular thank yous for today's program. First of all, Professor Laura Pérez and everyone at UC Berkeley's Latinx Research Center. Here at BAMPFA, I'd like to thank Sean Carson, Dave Taylor, and Taylor Cobran for their logistical and technical support in many ways. Curatorial assistant Claire Frost, who took over the management of this art wall project from Apsara DeQuinzio, our former curator for Matrix and Modern Art. Claire wrote the essay in the brochure, which I invite you to pick up as you leave. It is in a little lucite container at the top of the stairs next to the mural. Everyone associated with the studio and estate of Luchita Hurtado, and as we go through this program, you will understand the reasons why we feel such gratitude to them. And of course, our panelists. So our discussion today, Luchita Hurtado, Embodying Landscape, is occasioned by this wonderful mural, which is the result of our extremely good fortune in having acquired a singular large-scale drawing by Luchita Hurtado in 2019, a year before her death. The mural itself, which Luchita titled I Live Here, was installed concurrently with our recent exhibition, New Time, Art and Feminisms in the 21st Century, organized by Apsara DeQuinzio. Originally, we planned to have this discussion in late January, which would have overlapped with the last week of New Time, but you know, COVID and other things. So we remained committed to having our conversation in this space alongside the mural. So here we are on the final day of its exhibition. We intend today's discussion to be just the beginning of an exploration of the connections between Hurtado's life, art, and words, and those of later generations of Latinx Chicanx artists. In particular, we'd like to consider the spiritual aspects of her work and life, the body and self as part of nature in her work, and her identity and social position as both female and Latina. It's a long overdue discussion, and I believe we've assembled the right group of people to have it. First, we'll hear from Marie Heilich, who will set the stage for all of us by sharing an overview of Hurtado's work from across her life, leading up to her creation of this large-scale drawing. Marie is eminently qualified to do so. As a writer and curator based in Los Angeles, she began collaborating with Luchita Hurtado to collate her nearly century-long biographical timeline, and there are copies of that along the stairs. We invite you to take one and keep it. It's printed out with Marie's permission. And this was subsequently published in the catalog for the Artist Survey exhibition, I Live, I Die, I Will Be Reborn, at the Serpentine Gallery in London. Since Hurtado's passing in 2020, Marie has served as archivist for her estate. Okay, then we'll hear from Celia Herrera Rodríguez. Celia is a Chicano Odami painter and performance and installation artist whose work reflects a full generation of dialogue with Chicano, Native American, pre-Columbian, and Mexican thought. She teaches Chicanx art history and studio practice at UC Santa Barbara, where she is also co-director and, in fact, co-founder of Las Maestras Center for Chicana Indigenous Thought, Art, and Social Practice. Among her recent projects is a collaboration with the Chocheño Ohlone community in Oakland called Making Ohlone Visible. And I'd also like to highlight her recent work was the subject of an exhibition here at UC Berkeley's Latinx Research Center. Next, we'll hear from Los Angeles-based Chicana artist Irina Cervantes. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today for personal reasons. It was very last minute. So she had prepared and thought a lot about this, and Professor Laura Pérez will present the material that Irina had prepared on her behalf. Cervantes' extensive body of work reflects over 40 years of exploration and an iconography informed by native Mesoamerican mythology and cosmology, Mexican art traditions, Chicanx poetics, and themes of justice and human rights. Her work is held in many collections, including that of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And for 20 years, until 2019, she taught in the Department of Chicano Studies at Cal State University, Northridge. Following these three introductory presentations, Professor Laura Pérez will moderate a conversation among all the presenters and then, after a while, open it up for questions. Laura is a professor of Chicanx, Latinx, and ethnic studies here at UC Berkeley, where she is also chair of the Interdisciplinary and Trans-America's Latinx Research Center. She is the author of the groundbreaking 2007 book, Chicana Art, The Politics of Spiritual and Aesthetic Alterities, as well as other titles including Eros Ideologies, Writings on Art, Spirituality, and the Decolonial, published in 2019. With Dr. Anne-Marie Lemer, she is co-editor of the forthcoming Consuelo Jimenez Underwood, Art Weaving Vision, to be published by Duke University Press in June of this year. So now, as we begin with Marie's introduction to the work of Luchita Hurtado, please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you, Karen. I'd like to thank BAMPFA and the Latinx Research Center for organizing this program today. It's very exciting to be here. As Karen mentioned, my role has been archivist of the estate of Luchita Hurtado. And with in-person gatherings being restricted over the past 2 years, this is an incredibly exciting moment for the estate, as it's sort of the first museum program that is launching research. And we are also thankful to Laura, Celia, and Irina for their knowledgeable insights to kick off the scholarship that's all yet to come. I Live Here is Hurtado's first and only commissioned mural, and I would just like to acknowledge Brenna Ivanhoe, who is here in the audience with us today. Brenna served as Luchita Hurtado's studio manager, and she was integral in working with the museum to make sure that all of the markings were so nuanced and precise, and it was just incredibly special that she was able to know Luchita's hand and work and be able to work with the museum on behalf of Luchita for this special project. As the title here of my presentation suggests, I will be focusing on themes of spirituality, nature, and identity through abstraction, self-portraiture, landscape, and language. There are certainly other artistic strategies that Luchita used throughout her oeuvre that spoke to these different themes that I won't be able to touch on today. Just for example, she worked often to paint light or heat throughout her work, and that's sort of speaking to this natural spirituality component. Another example would be the sort of radial compositions that so often compose her works that sort of speak to a social identity of inhabiting both a center and a periphery simultaneously. However, for today's presentation, I will be using the mural as a lens through which to read her entire life's work. So since I'll be covering over 80 years of an artistic practice, I found that approaching this work chronologically sort of not only makes the material a bit more digestible, but it also reflects the diaristic nature of Hurtado's practice. These two slides here span 74 years, and not only represent this vast time span in between, but also represent themes that were consistent throughout Hurtado's practice. So we have this early self-portrait from 1945, and a series that she was making of trees as self-portraits in 2019. Although this image is a bit more tree than portraiture, I'll get to some of the same series later in the slides that are more of a merging of the figure and trees. While Luchita was very consistent in the themes of her work of nature, spirituality, and identity, she often experimented with styles widely, including mediums and techniques that she was trying out. And so while her life's work can be divided into distinct series, like many great artists, she's often visually sampling herself and using her own visual vocabulary over many years. And so oftentimes there are works that sort of don't fit within any series, but rather will straddle two series that I sometimes refer to as her transitional works. And we will see some of those as we go. These transitional works make up almost a film slide. If you're thinking of stills in a film slide, and the stills being her paintings, you can almost start to see them morph and change as if it was moving. And so I think that you'll see what I mean when we get to those. Here we have an example of one of Hurtado's earliest abstractions. She was working with a technique of applying ink over a waxy crayon surface. It would seep into these negative spaces where you see the black, and then on top of the waxy surface sort of form these patterns of beaded ink. Here, this is some of Hurtado's earliest inquiries into landscape and abstraction, both dated 1947 to 1949 roughly. And the work on the left can actually be visited at SF MoMA currently. When interviewed about her childhood in Caracas, Venezuela, Luchita often connected knowing that she was an artist from a very young age to her relationship with sensations that were accessed through nature and spirituality. The smell of a butterfly hatching from a cocoon or the scent of incense in church, these communions were able to form the world around her and sort of gave her a self-appointed authority and permission to exist in the world and to create in the world. And I think that this very foundational early realization that she was one with the world really she was able to build on throughout her career. I'm now going to give a brief run-through of events that sort of lead up to the 1960s. And this is the time when Luchita's practice really gains momentum. And then I'll go through some slides from the 60s sort of onward that will relate to the mural. This piece is from 1961. So Hurtado was born in 1920, just outside of Caracas, Venezuela, and immigrated to New York with her family at 8 years old. While living in a busy household with her mother's two sisters and their children, she taught herself English. She was motivated to take the hour-long commute to a vocational high school where she studied art, only revealing this to her mother on graduation day that she was not, in fact, studying dressmaking as her mother thought. Luchita then furthered her studies at the Art Student League before aiding the anti-fascist movement by volunteering at the New York Spanish newspaper La Prensa, where she meets her first husband, Daniel del Solar. After some adventures in the Dominican Republic, where del Solar was establishing a new newspaper, they returned to New York, where she had her first son, Daniel del Solar Jr., who became a prominent journalist and activist. This was then followed by her second son, Pablo, who tragically passed away at age 5 from polio. After resisting dressmaking for much of her youth, Luchita actually took it up again so that she could design whatever clothes that she would imagine for her sons and herself. And with family life largely demanding her days, Luchita really resourcefully made time to paint at night while her family slept. And this was a practice that Luchita continued throughout her life, of working into the night and sort of carving out a durational room of one's own, so to say, to create. Her first husband leaves the family, sort of stranding Luchita with 2 young sons to raise on her own. And at this time, she began making mural displays for Lord and Taylor, as well as illustrations for Condé Nast to support her family. When Luchita was married to Del Solar, he was out on the street one day and he met this woman who was looking for a place to live named Ilis Gilmore. She was a dancer for Martha Graham, and Daniel Del Solar invited her to live with him and Luchita and her sons. She also happened to be Isamu Noguchi's half-sister, and this really forged a lifelong friendship between Luchita and Isamu Noguchi, who was a friend and mentor. Maybe not mentor, but artist that she was definitely influenced by throughout her life. So Isamu then introduces Luchita to Wolfgang Paulin, an Austrian artist and writer that was based in Mexico at the time. Luchita and Paulin begin a courtship, and Luchita agrees to join Paulin in San Angel, Mexico with her 2 sons, where she would make work in the corner of his studio. After the sudden death of her son, Luchita, Paulin, and Daniel Jr. moved to Mill Valley, where Paulin forms the Dynaton Artist Collective, along with Lee Mulliken and Gordon Onslow Ford, culminating in an exhibition at SF MoMA in 1951. This would be the same year that her marriage with Paulin sort of comes to an end, and she begins a relationship with artist Lee Mulliken, who was Luchita's husband for 47 years after that. After some sort of logistical maneuvering that the 2 had to do, they settle in Santa Monica Canyon, where they have 2 sons, John and Matt Mulliken. Here we're looking at a 1961 landscape, just sort of going back to her experimentation with merging landscape and abstraction. And then here we see a more figurative work from 1960. Here in the mid-60s, we see her playing in between notions of figuration and this concept of multiple horizons, which I will return to throughout. This also sort of relates to that film strip quality of duration in a way. A lot of times, speed was meaningful to Luchita in her work. Either she was working very slowly on works on canvas, which we'll get to, or with great speed. And so here is one of the works on canvas I was referring to. In the late 60s, she departs from her abstraction and sort of defines her I Am series, which she describes as corporeal female nudes looking down at themselves, feet planted solidly on the ground, like breasts, like mountains. They seem to be saying, "This is what I am." Here's another example of an I Am work. In the 70s, Luchita develops the concept of body as landscape. And this is sort of what I was referring to as a film strip quality, where the moon will become a ball or a mountain becomes a breast. And you can sort of see the merging of body and landscape throughout a wider view of her work. From her downward gazing I Am series, from here, Hurtado then connects the personal to the universal by lifting her gaze upwards to the sky in her Skyskin series. She referred to them as skyskins because, as you can see here, the negative space that delineates the periphery of the mountains forms a shape of an animal hide within the negative space of the sky. And these are often punctuated by clouds or moons or feathers throughout. The series also recalls Hurtado's time spent in Taos, New Mexico, where her and Lee Mulliken built a home in the early 70s. As powerful as Luchita's works on canvas are, there's also a lot to be gleaned from her works on paper, which depict often botany, landscape, as well as self-portraiture. This work on paper, in particular, of a hand turning into vines, Luchita said was directly inspired by the Bernini sculpture Apollo and Daphne, where the woman Daphne is literally turning into a tree, and will influence her later works of trees as self-portraits, which we'll get to. These are all 70s works on paper. This painting is one of the first where Hurtado was using the concept of multiple horizon lines, which we see referenced here in the I Live Here mural. In an artist statement from this time, Hurtado is talking about times when she goes not painting for a while, whether it's months or I don't think it was ever years that she went without making work, but she would definitely have times of not making work. And she says, "Painting again, I could refine my own personal center, my own personal world. And isolated, working alone, I could manage to think myself as a ridge of moderate elevation made of reeds that caught the light, naturally communicating thoughts and images." I really appreciate how this quote illustrates this sort of mountain ridge in direct connection with her body, which she then directly connects to the act of self-expression. Here we have Untitled You from circa 1970s. She was also, in this time, working with language often, and which we see reflected here in the mural. In this particular work, we can see here that she's using the Y of the U as a tree, the O as a moon or a sun, and the U as a hole in the ground. And so she's really merging, literally, language and landscape here. Here's another example of the U, tree, moon, hole. She's also using these word text-based works. She works in between English and Spanish and really using them towards an end of self-identification. So here we have woman, womb. Here's another woman example. This work says Venezuela backwards and forwards if you were to flip it around. And so she's really using the text-based works still in a self-portrait mode of thinking, even though they are clearly not straightforward self-portraits. Here's Soy from 1973. In 1974, Luchita has her first solo exhibition with the Women's Building in Los Angeles. It's there that she debuts this work. It's a new series of abstracted word paintings in which she invented a paint dispensing brush, which she could paint with great speed, drawing lines that would form words in English and Spanish before cutting the canvases into strips, rearranging them, and sewing them back together to sort of arrive at these buzzing abstractions. Here she's continuing to investigate language, abstraction, and portraiture. This work is titled Self-Portrait, and if rearranged, put back together, it spells out, "I live, I die, I will be reborn." This was used as the title of her survey exhibition at the Serpentine, as well as traveling then to LACMA in Los Angeles. This exhibition was supposed to travel to the Museo Tamayo in Mexico City. However, unfortunately, it wasn't able to due to COVID. This is an example of a work from 1980. I'm just sort of touching on decades now to show just the consistency in her thinking and output. This work is from 1990, where she's using her shadow as portrait against Taos, New Mexico landscape. Here we have a 2007 botanical drawing of a flower. In the midst of her resounding and long overdue recognition, this was during the last 4 years of her life, Luchita was making paintings that were akin to protest signs that really served as loud proclamations of environmental justice, stating in both English or Spanish these elements, as well as environmental statements such as "worms tilled the hard soil of our planet, not Adam and Eve," or "we are just a species," or "nowhere to hide." In some of the artist's more recent work, she was merging trees, seeds, and landscape with her self-portraiture, and really sort of then jumping off from there to hark back to her I Am series in a series of birth paintings wherein, here we go, a child's head is sort of rising like the sun from a horizon of the body of a landscape. Here we have two birth works. The one on the left is a drawing from 1950, and the other is a painting on the right from 2018. What I appreciate about this pairing is not only how far apart they were made in time, but also the sort of shift in perspective from the perspective of the infant to the perspective of the mother shifting. And here we have a work that really relates to her body as landscape, but in a birth depiction. From roughly 2018 to 2020, Hurtado was recalling again these multiple horizon lines in her work, often fused with the language of environmental activism. So here we see more. And so really this pairing of environmental activist language with the multiple horizons of the landscape bring us eventually to I Live Here. We have that. And so now I'm very pleased to turn the floor over to Celia.
Thank you. Thank you, Marie. Well, I have to say that the first thing that struck me about Luchita's work was that I didn't recognize her, and I was so. It was in discussion with Irena that I began to see, and I had to say that because I feel that there's something about the way that she was formed, the times that she worked through, in which perhaps she was looking to see herself, looking for who she was in the world, and so I'm so, in some ways, I was grateful for my own blindness and my own prejudice, with the eyes that I've learned to see through, and not recognizing a sister. And so I wanted to say that because it's been such a struggle, I believe, that she is a part of. And so I had to go back then and do, recover the same ground, remember the ground, remember what I saw as I was coming up. And the second thing that came to me was that I was so sad that she was not my teacher. And I thought, if only I could have had her as a teacher, I may have been able to recognize myself sooner and the work that I was doing sooner. And perhaps she would have seen herself in the young people that were having or were conducting the same kind of search. And I say that because it is a political, spiritual struggle that we have undergone, through the decades. I could go through timelines, and I would have to keep backing up, and maybe 500 years, since we always say, as Chicanx, that we cannot tell a story without going to the beginning. And the beginning of our story is connected to the land. And it's difficult to tell because of the separation between our story and our ability to be grounded on the land. And so I see her work coming to life because I had to remember her. So if I could have my slides, please. I'm not sure where to find them. Oh, I see now. Do I just hit on it? Thank you. Yes. Thank you. So I wanted to talk about first language. What language it was that I was searching for as an artist that wasn't available to me. And I always say I had to petition for a release from my units in art history as an art student into ethnic studies. I ended up in Chicano, Native American, and feminist studies in search for a language that I could speak, that I could reflect on as an artist. And I didn't want to work in translation. even though I was very young, I knew that I didn't want to work in translation. I wanted to know what was there in primary language. So I'm looking at Luchita as from, I would say, a Chicana perspective. I'm looking at her work, in terms of what came before me. So I'm sorry, I'm not sure how visible this slide is because it is pencil on paper, and I'm dying to see it in person. But I looked very closely, and I found these lines so softly drawn in 1945, and it made me think of Wilfredo Lam. And I thought of Wilfredo because of having made that statement that he made of solidarity with this land, only to be almost erased, when in the history of modern art. And so Wilfredo, to me, a storyteller who based his work in the culture of his family, I felt it was important for me to remember then, the context of Luchita's work. So I found these pieces and the shapes they made and the colors they used, and I thought to myself that this work, I would have liked to have seen it in the same space, in the same time as Wilfredo. And we weren't able to do that. And there's something to be said about that we see her now and we have to put her back into history. So I'm looking forward to those exhibits in which her work is returned to that moment in history in which it was created, with the same ideas and the same perspectives and the historical context which I believe she was thinking. I think it's important then to think about her making art in the corner of her partner's studio. I think it's important to know that she made art in her kitchen, that she was visited, that she shared space with many, many artists, but although she was constantly making art, she never put it in place with those artists. It was always something very personal and very close to her. And so when we think of Rufino Tamayo in New York and being befriended by her, by the space and the home that she created, that the two of them sitting at the table drawing is something that we have shared so often as Chicanas, supporting each other in the making and thinking, in the intimacy that is not always available in the larger space, although we're here in the same timeline as everyone else making art. So I thought it was important then that the friendship wasn't just a cute story, but a way in which she had the support to make work. And because she should have been teaching alongside of Rufino at the same time in those schools at that particular period. So I thought also then of Ben Shahn, looking at Ben Shahn, and I wanted to then remember him, especially right now, since he was born in what was the Russian Empire, now known as Lithuania, and came as a young man, a man whose work I loved because of his politic and his spiritual politic of always remembering us as human beings, and the way in which he constantly spoke up in society, and the way that he just, I don't know, I saw it as a young person as a commitment. It was a commitment that allowed me to follow along. There was a ground which to walk on. And so I wanted to include him because I felt that some of the work that she was doing, the way that she was using line and shape and color, to talk about the spirit and to also talk about the politic, that reminded me of Ben Shahn. And I thought, okay, along the same place, along the same lines, along the same years. So I thought it was interesting, again, that, one of the places that she found herself and found the ability to exhibit was in the women's building, in the women's movement, that she saw herself reflected, that women called her name. And I thought that mattered, and that she exhibited. And so I also think it's interesting that language then became a force in her work, as she had to say it, as she had to draw it, as she had to write it. You know how you how you draw and you read and you think and you say, and it gets committed and it builds and it becomes. And so these pieces of saying woman and womb and making herself visible in that sense came through the women's movement. And I thought that really mattered. And so I also then came back again to Sean in this sense of liberation. Because we're seeing these landscapes right now. They don't seem to go away. They continue to be present in how things fall apart and things are fragmented and how we have to keep recovering our culture. Right now, I think, how many people are on the road, how many children will grow up without the knowledge of their place of origin, of their home ground? How do you hold on to culture in that manner? The specificity of what we bring to this world as human beings. So in solidarity right now with what is happening in our time. So I come back to Luchita in 71 with that experience in the women's movement, seeing herself and not being able to see herself. It's very rare that we actually see her. And as she looks at her body and lights that flame, I thought there was such an important piece to be able to, even if she says she's told in her story, locked herself in the closet to be able to see herself in the midst of this. I mean, in some ways, she had great privilege, was in a position of great privilege. Yet I remember that she was there as wife, that she was there as mother, that she was there as a provider of ground for others to stand on. And yet, she persisted through this, somehow holding on to her ideas and holding on to this purpose that she had. So I wanted then again to she collected. She was part of a culture, of a time that collected, that saw something there in that work that reminded her of her humanity and who she was, and I believe then began to use that language, used it all along, but it became more visible as time went on. So I wanted to think about folks like Helen Harden. Within One Soul, Two Spirits Cry Forth, 1978. And Helen then, in the tradition of the Pueblo painters, sort of breaking through this sort of constructed image to use line, shape, color, a language then that is older than the painterly language that we have learned. And again, I feel this piece, Changing Woman, as she begins to speak about herself, her truth, her time, and what it took for her to get to the table, to get to the wall, to be able to paint and speak. And then I wanted to think about Frank Lapina, one of my maestros, Northern California went to, whose markings, whose teachings in the classroom always contained storytelling, always it emphasized to us the importance of having a story, of having our story, of utilizing whatever method it was to remember that story, from line to color to shape to design, as he held on to, as you can see in this piece, the stories that were handed to him. One of the most impactful painters here in Northern California, and I want, again, Frank to be present. And interestingly enough, I found this piece that reminded me of one of the roundhouses here in California, constructed in some of the rural areas, that helped keep the culture together through very dire times, that formed a whole collection of community within those times. And I see her actually in her body moving towards something. And even though this is a basket and not that form, it reminded me so much of that movement forward. And so I brought Yolanda Lopez, and I thought about how she taught us to see, how she went back and took these images and put them together and made form for us, a language for us. And I'm looking at the years that Luchita's working, the years in which she's working, and I wondered, did she see us as the Chicano movement? Did she see us? Were we present in her landscape? I'm not exactly sure if that's true or how that was, because of where she was living, of how she came into her world and came into this world in Santa Monica. So I was curious about that. I tried to look through the book to see if there was any indication of that, and perhaps that's the work that we still have to do to make those connections. And I'm not going to speak too much about Elena Cervantes' work. I think about her work all the time in terms of how she presents, how she embodies, how I feel that in our practice, that the only thing we have is the making of marks. You know, it's kind of like scratching the surface and opening up the memory. And so Irena, who symbolizes, you know, this water, lightning, thunder, rain, all of these marks of the waters on her face as she assembles herself and looks through it, and we see her directly through this mask, and so she embodies then this language. I thought that was in such, Luchita's also, that was a search that she was conducting, you know, remembering a language to use to say who she was and to give us the markings for her trajectory. So I went back to my own work and I was looking at some of the symbols and the shapes and the ideas and the stories, recovering them again, you know, from what is scattered, what's fragmented all around us. I was trying to remember as Irena was speaking about the poetics of language. I was thinking of Alfred Arteaga, our colega at Berkeley, and the way that he was thinking about language. He had a poem that reminded me so much of Luchita's work, and as I look at the grandmother walking through the 3 tiers of our universe, I ran across one of Alfred's poems in Canto Primero. So feminine a shape, so female a bay, another shape, gliding birds, another, touching trees. True name of woman, Veracruz, body of woman. He named me Xochitepec, yes, so we are all flowers of the mountain, all a woman's body. That was one true thing he said in his life. Above birds, leaves, above so woman, a form. And I felt that in some ways that was a search that we had, you know, in coming through the path, constantly always moving through history, never really being allowed to ground ourselves and search through in the manner that, you know, that we never have had permission to look at our roots and to hold our things and to tell our story. So the idea then of that movement brought me to this piece. The umbilical cord of the earth is the moon. Because of the power and the usage of the materials, the reflection of the feather, which has always been used traditionally to tell who we are, to present and to connect us and to empower us ourselves through the embodiment of the sacred. The only way to embody the sacred is to actually make. You put your hands on it, you touch it, you form it. So that's what I have. Thank you.
Should I just use a little bit? Okay. So Irena Cervantes unfortunately can't be with us today, but I'm really grateful to her for having put together a slideshow and having selected some of Luchita's quotes and kind of put those together, as you'll see in a minute. And I'm also really happy that she shared with us a statement on her reflections. We had a lot of conversations, as with Celia, sending texts to each other, you know, over the last who knows how many weeks, sending videos we discovered, and just really trying to understand this artist more and sharing our thoughts. And so she had just thought so much, she'd given so much thought to Luchita's work, that I'm just happy that she was able to share something with us, which I'll read in a moment. And I also just wanted to say that, you know, in Karen's and my thinking about a conversation today, which will historically be some of the first conversations, along, of course, with Marie's own work, which reflects a great deal of reflection and scholarship. We were just thinking about how Celia's work
And Irena's work is also this very powerful body of visual thought that is thinking a great deal about the meaning of being, right? And from that point, what does it mean to be on the planet? And not least, what does it mean to be on the planet right now, right? But also, what does it mean to be on the planet as a gendered person under patriarchy? And what does it mean to be on the planet as a body red as brown, right? These are some of the questions, and I think that in addressing the dehumanization of sexism, racism, and the other isms, how to return like perspective and context to what it is to be human in a shared way. And I think that these artists, Irena, Celia, and Luchita, have some kinds of, I think, exploration, some kinds of inquiries, and some kind of rebalancing for us when we look at their work, especially the way that they place the human body, the female body, the brown body within the context of nature, and then blur the boundaries so that nature self becomes really foregrounded in a way that invites us to think about self in a bigger way than some of the marginalized ways that we have to occupy self sometimes. So to me, that's incredibly important and radical and necessary right now. So I want to share Irena's statement before we show some of the slides. So Irena Cervantes titled this Luchita Hurtado, Embodying Landscape. And she says, learning more about the art and life of Luchita Hurtado has been a revelation. I saw her work at the Hammer Museum in the Made in LA exhibition in 2018 and was fortunate enough to hear her speak in an interview there. It was clear to me that this was an artist who had led a full life, a woman that was comfortable in her own being and was the epitome of what it is to live a life with conviction and purpose. Yet, as I began to read more about her, certain questions came up. Mainly, why had it taken until the last decade of her life for Luchita and her work and her art to receive the attention and support that she deserved? After all, she had been creating art for most of her life. And how was it that a woman that was constantly surrounded by and interfacing with many artists, and who was indeed married to artists, was not more visible as an artist herself? For me, Luchita was a woman ahead of her time, but also a woman of her time. Ahead of her time in the sense that she had an adventurous spirit, took great risks, and broke through many of the conventions and restrictions placed on women, especially a young Latina woman living in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and yet a woman of her time because she also had to mother, roles that she valued, and be wife, roles that she valued, but which made for a difficult balance. Something it seems her artist husbands did not have to contend with. However, Luchita maintained a joy for life and a special way of looking at the world and living each day. It is also amazing to me that she managed to raise 3 very creative sons, activists, artists. Her involvement with other artists in the women's movement gave way to more confidence in her work, and very importantly provided encouragement and the space for exchange and creativity. The range of media and expression she explored over time is impressive. I'm particularly drawn to her self-portraits in their many forms. I also appreciate her use of text in other works, sometimes obscure or more bold, as in her drawings and paintings addressing the care and preservation of nature. All of these works are important to me. In the early 70s, I and other Chicanas were developing a political consciousness and self-awareness as women, just as Luchita was embracing feminism, appreciating more the value of her work, and coming into her own. At the university, in education and the art world in general, there was such an absence, erasure of women artists of color. Not even Frida had been included in art history, at least not in this country. Had we known of Luchita, a contemporary Latina artist living in the US, and had been taught about her art, it would have made all the difference to us. but I and other Chicanas and women of color artists would have to wait too many years for the work of Luchita Hurtado and others to come to attention. Hopefully things are changing in the educational and art institutions so that it will be different for younger generations looking for inspiration and connection in the work of women of color. Luchita's self-portraits resonate deeply with me, and her spirituality, commentary on issues of the environment, and her commitment to change align with my own concerns for social and environmental justice and for the sacred. I understand fully what it means to declare, I am, yo soy, and finally to be seen and heard. I have found both beauty and complexity in Luchita Hurtado's powerful works, and at times been confused with some aspects of her life. But I am so grateful for the opportunity to look closely at the life and work of this most authentic human being and artist. I only wish I'd been able to meet her. So that was from Irena Cervantes, and also giving many thanks to BAMPFA, to Karen, to Celia, to Marie. So I'll continue and show you the slideshow that Irena put together. Autorretratos, self-portraits. At a certain point, I said, there is no way that I can express, let's say, except by painting myself. So a quote from Luchita. And this is one of Irena's self-portraits. So Irena Cervantes is well known as one of those rare artists who have spent an enormous amount of time exploring like the possibilities of self-portraiture. And you'll see a few more of her pieces. So I think that the idea of the I am, yo soy is especially powerful in Irena's work. And here's another quote from Luchita. Looking back, I was also always searching for myself. I wanted and needed to grow, to be an individual. No one encouraged me. I seemed to threaten the order of things. This is one of the earliest pieces that was done in honor of Frida Kahlo, who in 1978, when this watercolor was made, had still not been quote unquote discovered. In Mexican art history books, by very prominent Mexican art historians, Frida Kahlo was still being described as the wife of Diego Rivera, who also paints. So this was an incredible part of the Chicana and Chicano art movement, this discovery of Frida Kahlo, and kind of in tune with this whole conversation, like that great need to find models of artists who had created works that were asking similar types of questions. And Irena includes herself in the mirror here. So it's a very clever, witty, two Fridas kind of self-portrait. And the other thing that's so important here, of course, is the idea of the birth, giving birth to oneself, right? Which is, I think, one of the themes that Luchita also puts out there for us, what it means to discover yourself and to continue searching through arts to express yourself. And this quote from Luchita reads, "This is a landscape. This is the world. This is all you have. This is your home. This is where you live. You are what you feel, what you hear, what you know." This is from Irena's Danza Oceloto, done in 1983. And Irena writes that this is a self-portrait that reflects the interconnectedness with nature and other living beings and entities. And the mask for her is not to conceal, right? But rather to show the merging, or to suggest the merging and becoming one with the various natural elements and symbols that are expressed on the face, máscara. Irena writes that all of the different kinds of symbols there for nature suggest that we embody and are made of the same substance of the universe. This piece includes the quote from Luchita, "I am here, I am here. Survival is an energy. I am trying to paint energy and the sky." This is from Irena's Nepantla triptych, which is one of the most brilliant pieces of self-reflection on visual colonization. You know, what does it mean to have your vision trained as to what you can see and what you can't, and how in a racist and the colonial legacies, there are things that are not really visible to us, that are not really considered important. And so it's just one of her most interesting reflections on what it means as an artist to try to decolonize, right? A Eurocentric art history. What does it mean to be an artist trained Eurocentrically in the history of images, but also what gets to count as art itself? This is the quote here from Luchita: "We need to think of all living things in this world as our relatives." And this is from her, this is a 2019 Untitled piece. This is one of Irena's more recent pieces, 2014. Do you know where it's at? Searching for My Mojo, where she's having a conversation with a jaguar, which is an animal that appears in her work quite a bit, and that signals thinking about identity beyond the literal, and rather what are the energies that are embodied by the jaguar. I was struck how at one point Luchita herself points to the panther, right? As you know, and the panther typically in indigenous cultures, and jaguars are like symbolic of the earth. Those four legs of the panther are part of the earth creatures. The quote here: as artists, we should shout out about the most important issues around us. Don't speak in a low voice. That's it. Don't speak in a low voice. Shout. And this 2020 piece, which is a work in progress from Irena, is a piece that is in homage to indigenous environmental activists in Latin America that have been murdered in very recent times. And she included, as part of the artist's statement here, that this piece was dedicated to human rights and environmental defenders that have been killed throughout Latin America, many of whom are indigenous peoples, the original guardians of our natural resources, y la madre tierra, Mother Earth. And she calls this an ofrenda painting honoring Berta Cáceres, the Honduran Lenca woman who was murdered, Homero Gomez Gonzalez, an environmental activist of 20 years old who was also murdered, Engui Roy Martinez Pérez, 21-year-old, who was also murdered. And then Irena includes this beautiful quote from Francisco Alarcón, another Chicano poet that died too early. And it's from his Snake Poems, An Aztec Invitation. And the excerpt reads: "Soy yo, I am, el de tu cepa, from your tree, de tu sueño, from your dream, este sensontle, this sensontle bird, del monte, in the wilderness, tu mañana, your tomorrow." So finishing up here, the quote: "After all, settled and colonized women have always seemed to hold their own, instinctively recognizing their true source, sensing their affinity to both mountain and leopard." Oh, see, I changed that leopard to a panther, so I'm corrected. And then this is Irena's own big baby, Balam, Balam being jaguar. And as Celia started to point out, one of the things that Irena did in this self-portrait was to put the glyphs, so taking from a pre-Columbian, Meso or Middle American art history, and using like the stylized glyphs to symbolize water, but also to symbolize corn, and the idea that we are made of not only the earth, but corn itself, the spotted pelt of the jaguar mouth, which you see in pre-Columbian art, pre-Columbian sculptures, etc. The only reasonable facsimile of me is my shadow. That is really fascinating, and I hope we can talk about that some more, a Luchita quote. So that was that, and maybe I'll leave it here. Thank you. So maybe I could just start it. I mean, we don't have a huge amount of time, and I know that people probably have their own comments and questions, but I think I would just ask if either one of you have like any like comments in response to the presentations, or just, you know, thoughts that are occurring to you as we're moving along that you want to share. And I would love to also just throw out some themes as well that maybe we can also talk about. Any thoughts, Celia? Anything you wanted to kind of add? so much.
Trying to filter things through.
I know. It's a lot of words. It's a lot of images. Well, I'm really fascinated by one of them. That one. Thank goodness it's up. I was thinking about it this morning. So one of these shadow pieces, right? These shadow self-portraits. I think I'm fascinated by how even in the pieces that look very geometric, that look like most abstract, that she had made by cutting up like words, like I am, I live, I die, I will be reborn, and that are really, they're impossible, really impossible to make out all of those words, even when you have been warned that they're there. And so I think that that's like so fascinating if we think about it in connection to how the quote from the shadow, right? The idea that, that this is like the closest facsimile. It makes me think of like what a profound, what a complex idea that she had about her own identity and about self and about being, right? That it was not an easy thing to define self. And so to me, like her self-portraits, would be so far from just being representations of herself, even at various stages of life. Like now I'm like going through a very profoundly unhappy time or, whatever. And so I'm really fascinated by this like more profound notion of being as this becoming, as this evolution. And I'm also fascinated, although I don't know if we're going to be able to go with this anywhere here, but I'm really, really struck by self-portraiture as being this, like a method, like a tool, a medium that has been used by many women to think beyond like the limiting identities that they have been given. And Irena's work certainly makes me think of that, like, the masks that make it hard for us to read her in like these negatively racialized or gendered ways that tell us there's something more complex, right? And then this image, which is up there where the light piece is, where she's cut a square in, the chest or the heart area, and it's this emanation of light. So I think, I don't know, I'm just really fascinated with this sense of self and identity in her work that I think raises questions and kind of makes it hard to like end up with like narrow definitions. But any thoughts from both of you about that or other comments?
One thing that was touched on in Celia's presentation was this act of becoming, the process, and searching for role models. And it's incredible then that now we can look at Luchita as that, as she was going throughout this searching process through her life of becoming, that now in this moment we can sort of use her as a subject to find ourselves. And it's sort of this reciprocating process, which is very gratifying.
Well, I think the complication also, when I see this image, I think about the sculpture in Mexico. There's the sculptures that have the opening right here in this area. And they're I think they're intended to have something placed inside. But I think they also speak to the three spirits. There's one of the spirits that's located here in this area, the heart knowledge. So I don't know if that's what she was looking at. I would imagine she was, because she was around so much of this work, traveling back and forth, and because of her relationship, also, she was around these anthropologists and, looking at the pre-Columbian objects and sculptures. And so I would think that would be something that would influence her. And I think it's complicated in the sense that so much of the cultures were fragmented. They were destroyed. Well, not destroyed. They were attacked and bombed and reutilized and tossed about. And so I think that the work of the artist has been to try and locate. We're trying to locate and trying to assemble, trying to reassemble, trying to remember. So her work led me to Alfred Arteaga. Actually, I was walking past one of his books and I thought, Arteaga's always speaking about the language and memory, and then I ran across Bonfil Batalla talking about the repository of remnants. That the cultures, the whole cultures, fragmented, and many of us then have been doing the work of trying to sift through it to find what's ours, what's our language, and that is the becoming. And in the becoming then, when I look at Luchita's work, and it goes back to line, it goes back to shape, And Alfred had some pieces there that, what was it? So perfect the shape, right angles, the globe yields to a straight line, one line from zenith to nadir, a horizontal line so feminine a shape, a female bay. And I was looking at her like, okay, these two have had to have met in their work, at least. It's just so, his poetry and speaking about language and the recovery of it and the shaping of it and into something that is not English. It's not the colonial interpretation, but being able to speak, right, the original forms, the forms of origin. I think that's what I was seeing in her work. And I think that the complication is we're not allowed. There is this sense of like not being allowed. I remember a professor telling me that I couldn't put my hand in the paint and put it on the wall. That was, redundant. And I was like, well, why? Well, it's been done. And I'm like, by who? I didn't do it. Anyway.
Just another point of this sort of square shape that Luchita is showing in this portrait of a shadow it's reflecting upon also a series that I didn't get to touch on in my slideshow for time purposes, but her moth light series, where she's literally trying to render light to get a moth to come to the light, was something that. And then when you're talking about this heart space, thinking of that as a space of light, that really sort of dawned on me that's what that space that she was sort of rendering, the opposite of shadow, of light coming from her heart space. Yeah.
Sense of truth.
That's such a good thought to bring into the conversation, right? The idea of like that is like so important in Chicano thought, right? Making face, right? Making soul, aligning the heart and the face. And here the face is not so visible, right? That ancient idea of like integrity, that our faces should reflect our hearts and not be separate and different, right? Against like hypocrisy, So I think that's also just really fascinating. Celia, I also really appreciate your having talked in your presentation about like culture. And bringing that back into your comments right now, like, that the importance of having access to our culture, right? Whatever that culture is, whosever it is, and I think we take that for granted when we are part of mainstream or dominant culture, and sometimes we fail to understand how important and quote unquote natural that is for all people. And when I was reading about Luchita and this morning rereading, there was a passage, the interviewers were fantastic, and they asked her about her relationship to the pre-Columbian, and did that have a big impact on you? And she said it definitely did. Just as she also said that surrealism was the life she lived, not that she was a surrealist, but that whole life, she was in it, right? And so those two passages are right next to each other, but what felt really familiar was when she said that, yes, the pre-Columbian influenced her very much, but also that, so how do you identify? And she said that she did identify and did feel that she was also indigenous, but that within her own Venezuelan family, that was so hard to ever get at because of like internalized racism. I mean, now I'm adding internalized racism right now in my translation of that passage, and so that history of like, that doesn't exist and that's not important. And so that too is a struggle that I think, that I hope that we see more as people study, what was in her collections, what was in her writing, and that we can begin doing readings like the one you just did, Celia, that maybe we can also think about the sacred heart as it's understood in Mesoamerican art histories and Mesoamerican worldviews. Because I think if we lop that off because we want her to be accepted by the mainstream, then I think that would not really serve her own spirit. I don't think it's about politicizing her now. It's there in her writing. And she also talks about being seen, seeing herself and being seen as very dark. And so I also hope that what it meant for her as a woman to have to deal with that racialization in the world, all of it, including Venezuela, which he tells us a little bit about, is something that we'll also be able to kind of honor and really just think about what her achievements were. Frida Kahlo said that she hated the racism of gringos, so Luchita lived here and had to battle with it. So other comments or thoughts or, from either of you now at this point, as scholars and artists who work as people of color, we always have to think not only gender, but also of racialization and also class, right? And these types of questions and a forced kind of passing into mainstream art history. And I think that's one of the questions. Why was Luchita's work, I truly don't know the answer. That's not a rhetorical question. I really don't. Why was, as Irena asked, her work not more visible? She says that people looked at her work and they didn't seem to be that interested. Mm-hmm. So why is that? And why did she have to be so old or, for people to suddenly be able to have more interest in that work? But anyway, more comments, more questions. And what about, from you in the audience? Yes. I'll pass you the microphone.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
But I was going to try.
Yeah, so one thing that I noticed, sorry, I'm trying to get away from the speaker, is that in all of your works, you're challenging this notion of painting, or at least Western painting, how we think of it traditionally, mostly because in all of the work, Irena called the painting an ofrenda painting. I know, Celia, you call your installations ofrendas at times, and I see it very similarly in some of the work, like the umbilical painting that you showed with the feather work. And I'm just curious as to if you can comment on that, especially as Chicanas or Indigenous women from the Americas, in reclaiming this materiality or concept of painting, so to say, and how it might challenge the notions of art history or reframe it in some way. I'm wondering if you can speak on that. I know Irena's not here, but I know, Laura, you write about spirituality as well. Thank you.
But even so, I'll pass it to Celia.
Tricky. Well, the only way I can answer was, first of all, I have to come back to Bonfil Batalla, in this beautiful book, México Profundo, where he speaks about the culture of the Americas, the ongoing culture. And there's two things that I found really when I looked at her work, and I thought this is so true of her search, which was just in the middle, I'm just going to pop in here in this, it says, discrimination against that which is Indian, its denial as a major part of what we ourselves are, has much to do with the rejection of Indian culture than with the rejection of bronze skin. There is an attempt to hide and ignore the Indian face of Mexico because no real connection with Mesoamerican civilization is admitted. The clear and undeniable evidence of our Indian ancestry is a mirror in which we do not wish to see our own reflection. And then again, he says in the second chapter of Indian Recognized, one of the ways of avoiding the problem of Mexico's Indian identity has been to ideologically convert one sector of the national population into the repository of the remnants that, in spite of everything, admittedly remain from that foreign past. And so that's what I mean by there's a resistance. And so for us to go into the work is to go up against that resistance. There's no way to think about, the decolonization process, but to go through what has been deep trauma in our own families, amongst ourselves, to get past those restrictions, the things that tell us that we're not allowed to, and explore, pick it up, touch it. That's why the ideas then of ofrenda, because ofrenda also implies sacrifice. It also implies, that if you dare touch, look, see, speak, you are going to be punished, even if it's in invisibility, of not being seen, of not being recognized, from within and from without. So it is a process then that you have to, it doesn't seem so, it seems so innocuous, the act of making a mark, the act of painting, But when you call it and you try to refer to it back to its place of origin, not what has been translated, not what has been acceptable, but to really look at what it means to speak, and you're trying to speak that language, which, sometimes I say it, I hear it from my tongue, but I don't know. I don't know. And it's the daring to not know and make yourself the authority of not knowing, where you just insist. And that is what he was speaking to. And I think this is what the work is also about in one's own trajectory as an artist, to dare, to know you are, and yet to know that you're not seen. I felt that from her in all the ways that she's presented in her work, that she is insists. She insists, but she also keeps it here. And I felt there must have been a reason for that. But, at the same time, she's present in the history and all the conversation, all of the philosophizing, all of the experimental work. I mean, Noguchi was a friend of hers, found something interesting in her mind. My same frustration with Frida is I don't care who she slept with and that she had a bad relationship with Diego's tragic, but I wanted to know what she read. What was she thinking? What conversation did she have with the Trotskys? And we never get to hear that. We just get the same story, So that's how she's gone missing. And in fact, it's an amazing thing to be able to recover the history that like how many more of her are there? Just one last thing, about Yolanda Lopez, her exhibit. This last exhibit she has in San Diego, the curator shared how tough she was on her, how insistent she was about how she wanted things displayed. And all I could think of was that show, her one-person show that she died, a month before it opened? The one-person show, after decades of work, if you run into any Chicano artist in a history book, it's going to be Yolanda Lopez, at least so. And yet, not one person show until, all these decades later. And so I said to the curator, that show could have happened in 1989. It could have happened in 1985. It could have happened in 1981. All that work was already made. If it had happened, imagine how many more shows she might have had and how many more opportunities to discuss. So that one show didn't have to matter as much as it did to her. And how much more we would have gained in the same way that I say, I would have liked Luchita to be my teacher.
Kind of just like riffing off of that, I think when I began reading all of the interviews that I'm glad that people were able to have with her when she was alive, I was actually surprised, and then the timeline that you carefully created with her, I was surprised that there had been exhibitions, not a lot, but that there had been group exhibitions, because I think the mythology with Luchita was that they discovered her totally, that, completely there. No one had really seen the works. And in fact, it had been exhibited in group shows, but not a lot, but even in the 40s, there was one, I think, and it just didn't fly. And the question is, why not? Especially when you look back now and you compare it, the work of different eras to the art that was being made that is now recognized, there was so much there formally and ideologically, right? Absolutely. That was part of it. So why didn't that work? And then, yeah, did you want to?
No, it baffles me. Just the same sort of the, she was, of course, private with her practice, but what was the reason behind that privacy? It's sort of knowing your value and not accepting somebody else to devalue that seemed some sort of component to her thinking of sharing or not sharing.
Yeah, no, it does seem like she had this incredible sense of self and protection of self through all of it, through not receiving as much attention, as we would have liked to see her have, right? Which is also an amazing story of survival and what art meant, to her as a practice. Are there other comments or thoughts from folks in the audience? Yes.
In thinking about Luchita's identity, how do you think her connection to nature and her surroundings affected that? and how as she came to understand nature better, did that help her understand, what was happening within her inside and her body and experiences, and if paying attention to that helped her see nature from another perspective?
Yeah, I'll speak to this, and of course you can as well. But something that always came up every time I was talking to Luchita was this moment of when she realized she was an artist, and she says it in multiple interviews, and the things that made her know that she was an artist, that she was here to create, were sensations from nature. They were smells. They were, these really bodily, embodied sensations, telling her that she was of this world, and that therefore giving her permission, I think, to create because she was of the natural surroundings.
I think the maternity, all those maternity things can also be read that way. Following her own comments about it, like that giving birth was like such like an animal, like a material, corporal, like adventure. And then there's also all these erotic, right? These erotic drawings, and then her talking about how much she really enjoyed sex, So I think that there's a way of when she's quoted on I am, and the I am pieces, very much it seems like this reclamation of I am a body, right? I am embodied, right? And really, I mean, I think now, after all of this reading and watching of interviews, when I look at this piece, even if I didn't know what the title was, I would really think that this is another self-portrait, right? And, with I will be reborn, right? And I also think of like all the light, after all the color that she worked with, this beautiful drawing, right? A mural that is, everything's connected by the light, right? All of these different manifestations. So I think that thinking around nature, was very much, from what I can see from the interviews and the work itself, a lot of thinking about, this is a quote from her, interdependence, right? The interdependence of all things, including humans, and in those last pieces, trying to really shrink us down as humans into a sense of, caretaking and modesty within the bigger picture. Any thoughts?
Oh, I was looking at the mural. When you look at the mural and you realize that we're down here, we're corpses. And I was thinking about that. I was thinking about her perspective, and I was also admiring that, how brave she was, and got braver and braver to the point where she could draw a painting. I love that. I love that she could just say a painting, and in fact it becomes, it becomes poem, and also it becomes place, it becomes geography. That's great.
That's true. I've never thought about the text in her work as speech acts, but they are, because they're creating as they're embodying. Yeah.
And there's one of you too. No, I think you have to know this.
Well, thank you all very much. It was really, really informative. I really like what Irena said, how she said Luchita was a woman of her time, ahead of her time, but also of her time, which leads me to wonder her deep consciousness about her interdependency with nature and her deep interrelationship with all the elements. That was a consciousness much ahead of her time, correct? And so that makes me think that's why her art wasn't recognized, because it was an ancient consciousness, but it wasn't timely. And so now it is timely. It is on our consciousness, right? And so I'm thinking that's why she's being recognized now. It's just a guess.
I think that's a really good observation, right? Like, we're all interested in the environment right now, and her coining, I think she coined it, I'm not sure, her idea of the planetarian. I love that, right? That our first allegiance is to protect our planet, and that we are all that. Yeah. Fabulous, you also had a comment?
I wanted to ask about if you could talk about the feather a bit more in the umbilical cord of the earth is the moon. Like, what's your thought on, what did you think or feel about that piece? Doesn't have to be like just anything. And then I was also curious about what your feeling were about the piece where Luchita's looking down at her feet on the rug. I was thinking about the importance of the rug and carrying memory. Those two things. I'm curious if you could just talk a bit more about your thoughts on that.
Well, the rug, the textile, I guess in the indigenous worlds, there are many. There is no old word for art. It all the words mean making visible, communicating, bringing harmony. So they're all like philosophical statements or statements of creating, something that you can relate to. And so the weaving is one of the oldest forms here in the Americas, and the language of the symbol, the geometry of the weaving is also a language. It's one of the oldest languages. It connects us from one end to the other in the textiles. So for her to look down on her body, at her feet is that textile and that design and those colors, all those things, I think was her telling us that she knew that language. She knew what that was about. Not that necessarily she knew the language, but she knew its importance. So I think that the feather, because Carlos, I got in trouble for feathers most recently. Not to take it lightly, but it made me do more research on feathers. and what I know about feathers. What I know about feathers from my historical relationship to them. And then I was very grateful to, I wrote it down because I have to write these women a love letter, a thank you note. A woman, Lisa Sousa, an anthropologist who's doing studies on feathers and the meaning of feathers and the use of feathers in the pre-Columbian world. And so I was very excited to see what we already knew was that to use feathers, to connect to feathers, was to connect to the power of the radiance of the feather, that it actuated, that it reflected, and that it embodied the sacred. But it also meant, it was also historical statements that feathers then connected one to one's history. That was one of the ways politically that feathers were used, to connect to the sacred and also, as political statement. And so I thought of that, as she put it, as Diana Maglione put it, historical consciousness in understanding the origins of feather making, which I think is one of those indigenous thoughts, that there's no invention in a sense, that we acknowledge what came before and who gave it to us. There's always that remembering that we just didn't get here and find everything, that it came, somebody gave it to us and we passed it on. And we passed it on, and we passed it on. And so it belongs to us as human beings. And we have to then remember to be grateful to the source. And the feathers, I think, mark that politically and also spiritually. So it is a language. And so that's what I saw the feathers. I was thinking about the embodiment then, also then of how, in a sense, she was thinking about those. Yeah. What else? Let's see. Continue to see. Well, because she talked about the umbilical, which was, I felt, the animating forces associated with strength and life. That connection. Yeah. That was it.
Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, sorry. One thing that I've just recently realized about those works, I've looked at them for many years, and something that just sort of came to light to me was actually through a film by Tacita Dean that was recently shown, will be shown more. It was recently shown here. But in this film, it's called 150 Years of Painting, and it's between Julie Mertu and Luchita, and it's a conversation film by Tacita. And one thing that Luchita mentions when talking about the sky skin works, and especially the umbilical cord work, is that it's from the perspective of a grave, which I'd never heard her say before this interview. And that was just sort of an incredible revelation, again, going back to this sort of corpse and I live, I die, I will be reborn, and sort of just gave a whole new perspective of it. And then I started thinking further about this hole in the ground, the YOU hole that she was making, and then also thinking about her interest in heat and light and how these feathers are sort of floating above a hole as if there is a source of heat or light beneath it that are levitating them as a possibility. I'm not saying that this is an absolute reading, but it's just something that the more I look at these works, sort of the more is revealed that's intertwined throughout.
There's a piece that Esther Hernandez did that I first saw on the cover of one of Cherie's books, Las Madres, Mis Madres, or Madres Cósmicas. I'm murdering her title, unfortunately. But I saw one of the I am pieces of looking down, and Luchita's holding like an orb. And that's very much like Esther Hernandez's piece, where there's a cosmic mother with all this cosmic material behind her, and she's holding the little blue marble, right, which is the planet. And that made me think about how maybe she was also, by at that point in her life, Luchita, thinking about, like, you know, all of us as like creators, you know, connected literally to the earth as a creator, you know, through all of the seasons with like decay, but constant, you know, constant rebirth, you know, very little connection to what happens on the planet, you know. So other comments or thoughts? Cherie?
I was just curious about the white man phenomenon. The white man phenomenon in the history, right? That when you think about Frida, you think about Anmendieta.
Yeah.
For better, for worse. For better, for worse, one of the reasons we know them has to do with the white men they were around. And that's not a judgment, that's just a fact, right? And so it's curious because some of you think if you were, so she's the painter in the corner while this work is going on, right? So and there's a certain way in which the invisibility can serve the artist. It keeps the ego at bay. It allows you to go inside. It allows you to be the observer. You don't have to be the center of attention, you know. So I have multiple thoughts about this phenomenon of being at that time, you know, of not being in the picture. Certain freedom in it, also obscurity, obviously. But then the other part that I think about is also what, you know, as Chicanas, kind of wanting to recollect her for ourselves. It just reminds me that, in the same thing with the issue about the environment, just reminds me that political movements matter in relationship to art. That what made Chicana work visible and not Luchita singular is because there's a movement. And she was of her time and before her time, you know, as my sister just here was saying. So, did she think of herself? Did she, one, you asked this question, Celia, was she aware of this burgeoning Chicana movement of artists? And if she was, did she identify in any way with it? Or maybe she was disinterested in it. We don't have the answer. I mean, you probably would know better than I, certainly than I would. But those are certain questions, you know, because she couldn't be the teacher because there was no movement. You know, I mean, the movement is what allowed her, this what allowed you to teach. You know, my other sister artist here, you know. So those are just questions. There's no comments, just a bunch of questions came to my mind about it.
Thank you for that, Cherie. There's a lot in there, right? And one of the first things that popped into my mind was I was thinking about other women of her generation, like, you know, that died too young, by the way. But one that did not die too young was Leonora Carrington, who was very, very close in age to her. I think there's just a couple of years of difference between them. And, you know, Leonora Carrington also lived long enough to be able to reflect, you know, upon the sexist journey and the challenges to women artists. And, you know, so many of the women surrealists, or who were not actually surrealists, but that were partnered, sometimes those women weren't surrealists officially because they were so much younger, you know, than some of those men. And so I think about that, like, you know, it's always exciting to be having conversations with teachers that are much older. But I think when you're involved in a romantic relationship, you know, I think that's complicated under patriarchy, right? Because the apprentice child that's already happening in gendering, right? Unequal gendering just exacerbates matters. So that's why also I think of these themes of birth, you know, are so connected to birth of self for women artists. Scholars have pointed out, and poets, I'm thinking of Alma Villanueva, you know, pointed out that that coming of age stories in men's writing, even men of color, they're usually much younger, the coming of age. But for women, it's often in their 30s that they have stories about finally coming into their own. So I think there's just no way to not think about patriarchy, bless you, and about racialized patriarchy. There's just no way. And I don't think it takes anything away from the work. On the contrary, it's part of the necessary conversations, right?
Yeah, I love this point that you made about visibility, and it just makes me think of collective visibility through individuals, and just how you were saying the activist movements then allow for individual visibility and sort of vice versa, these two things working off each other simultaneously. It's great. More a comment than answers.
I keep wanting to toss it back up there and see what you all think about those things too.
The mic is not.
I don't want to cut it off if there's one more brilliant thing to say, so, or that sounds intimidating. If there is something else to say. So she was asking if the work is being toured.
Yes, there are exhibitions, and unfortunately this survey exhibition that was supposed to go to Maya was no longer traveling. She does have gallery exhibitions coming up. There's one in London that will feature the Skyskin series. As far as the estate is concerned, with our progress, everything has been archived and photographed, and our next sort of things on the docket are getting to her library, which we talked briefly about through the Kahlo, which is an incredibly exciting feat to sort of shuffle through what she was reading and thinking about. And so that's really on the horizon, as well as reading really closely her diaries. And while they have been skimmed, there has not really been like a close reading of those. So there's just a lot of scholarship coming up. And yeah, the estate just is looking forward to working with academics to further her research to be done.
Exciting.
I think what interests me is when I go to Frida's museum, I don't know whether the books have been artfully arranged or whether that's the way they were because that's how she was reading. You know, you see books by her bed, and I wanted to know what books was she reading together. And I would die to know the notes that were inside those books. So I think that's something that is interesting to me, like to know, like, what are we thinking through the years of our books, and
Well, that's a great point, and I'm glad that you made it, because Brenna has actually been keeping track of how the books were arranged on her bookshelf. We have photographed it, and Brenna was very carefully packing her library into boxes so that her bookshelf can be reconstructed as it was. We're very grateful for Brenna for that.
Well, I hope her work gets to move around a lot.
Yes.
Yeah, I do.
Well, it seems today is clearly just the beginning, and this is an artist who will become very important in American art history.
And I think I want to speak to what Cherie said about the times. I mean, one last thing I would like to leave us all with is that if we look around in terms of the university system, since we're sitting in one, and we look through the state system, and we look through the independent art schools, when I went to school, I had access to almost a dozen artists of color, Native, Black, Chicano, women, Asian. There were, and now that's not so. There has not been a commitment to the continuity of artists of color who are teaching. And in terms of Latino, Chicano, that we're almost bereft. You can do your research and look, and then write letters, because it's not over. In other words, because she was not teaching then doesn't mean there's someone there now. And I think that this, so I always ask myself, 40 years later, will we find another Luchita? This, there's so much that work that needs to continue. Things have not drastically changed in some ways. That, the art departments, art schools, the places where culture is made are still the, holdout of American culture. And who gets to determine that culture? And I think those are the ways in which we lose out on having the breadth and the depth, of who we are, where we are now. So, thank you.
Well, thank you to everybody, and thank you to the estate and your generosity of sharing all these materials. And it's exciting that you're taking care of the work, and we look forward to seeing more of it. So thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.